Hello and welcome back to Temple Time. I am super excited to be diving into the myth of Inanna's descent, her journey into the underworld today. I first kind of came across this myth a couple years ago. I want to share two books with you today, and I'll kind of be referencing these as well as reading a few excerpts from these. But the first one is Journey to the Dark Goddess by Jane Meredith. This describes her own descent, her own interpretation of Inanna's descent, essentially, and going into the underworld and what that kind of means. And then the other one, which I've already mentioned, Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth. This kind of also details her descent, along with her other myths as well, but it goes into like a folklorist's interpretation of all the symbols, because this story is filled with a lot of symbolism and kind of hidden meaning that like you don't always get the first time you read it, right? It's one of those things you really have to sit with and decipher and deepen into in order to understand. So let's get started. So in the descent of Inanna, we see Inanna decide to go into the underworld to pay her respects to her sister Ereshkigal after the death of Ereshkigal's husband, Gugalana. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. And her decision alone to travel into the underworld is uncommon. Most descents happen after, someone is separated from their family and they're trying to retrieve them. There's some sort of regression or falling backwards, or even having like a dark night of the soul, or because they died, right? They die and go to the underworld. The underworld is oftentimes a symbol of rebirth. Or we see people descend into the underworld because of the killing of another. And Inanna in this myth is going more or less to say hi to her sister, and her pattern doesn't really fit the normal reasons for descent into the underworld. So typically across myths, anyone who comes back from the underworld, which rarely happens to begin with, and like the ascension alone out of the underworld is rare, because usually once you're in the underworld, you stay in the underworld. So those who do come back from the underworld are often deemed a shaman or carry back with them some great and magical knowledge, providing a new worldview to their culture. And we see this with Enki, the god of wisdom, in the creation myth, the Hulupu tree, which we were talking about last week. And I didn't really go into Enki's part of it, but it's there. In that myth, he does descend and come back from the underworld. So you even see this with Odin in Norse mythology, or Hercules, or Persephone, which is one of the other common underworld myths. And it's these trips to the underworld that change them. So like any good protagonist, Inanna collects the things she needs for her trip. And she's this is kind of like a royal visit. So it's the Queen of Heaven and Earth visiting the Queen of the Underworld. So Inanna dresses in her best royal garb. She gets all dolled up, and the items she uses becomes her talismans, or these things that will essentially protect her during her descent. We also see her make arrangements with her servant Ninshubar, in case she would not return. So Inanna doesn't just descend without thinking ahead. There's a lot of thought, a lot of planning that goes into this. And she knows that her trip to the underworld might be difficult. And there's a chance that she'll have trouble coming back from the underworld. So she kind of puts a plan in place, like a rescue plan almost, in case, that happens. So when Inanna heads to the first gate of the underworld, she's met by a guard asking her, why'd you come? And Inanna tells the guard it's because of her older sister, Ereshkigal, and to witness the funeral of, her husband, Gugalana. The gatekeeper is like, okay, hold on. So he leaves her waiting at the first gate and he goes to Ereshkigal, letting her know that, her sister's at the gate. And Ereshkigal decides to have the gatekeeper let her in one by one, ensuring that her royal garments are removed as she goes along. So there are 7 gates to pass through. And so when Inanna passes through the first gate, her crown is removed. They take her crown away from her. And Inanna's like, wait, what is this? What's happening? And she starts to protest. But the gatekeeper responds, hush, quiet, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. I love this. This is like, what we do here, like, he's kind of saying, like, this isn't the norm. This is the underworld. Okay. There is a reasoning for everything, and you're just going to have to go along with it. And we see that, like, continue to play out. So she goes to the second gate, and at the second gate, her small lapis beads are removed. And again, she protests, and again, she's told to keep quiet and not question the ways of the underworld. At the third gate, her long double strand of lapis beads are removed. And again, she protests, and again, she's told to keep quiet, and this keeps happening. So the fourth gate, she goes through, her breastplate's removed. At the fifth gate, they take her golden armband. At the sixth gate, her measuring rod. And then at the seventh gate, her robe is removed. And essentially, she's left with nothing. She's naked at this point. And then she's ushered into the throne room where her sister Ereshkigal awaits. But I want to take a quick moment here and pause, and I want to read an excerpt from Jane Meredith's Journey to the Dark Goddess, because her imagery, the way she imagines Inanna's descent, just gives it more essence. It really kind of helps you put yourself in Inanna's shoes. So I'm going to read this, so bear with me. So this is her imagining Inanna descending into the underworld. 7 gateways I went through. 7 circles of hell I entered, into the deepest and the last. At the first gate, it became dark, and I could no longer see. Always I have been the queen of light. Always I have ruled in sunlight, or by starlight, or with candles in the temples. There was no light on the path to hell. Nothing I had experienced prepared me for the absence of sight. The darkness was such that I had to feel my way. I could not see the angles of the path or where it led, though my feet told me it went down. At the second gate, my voice seized up. I tried to talk to myself, to hold the fear at bay, but the darkness pressed in on me as if it were a hand held to my mouth. Sometimes there seems to be demons leaping about me, but when I questioned them, the words came out strangely, and I no longer sounded like Inanna. At the third gate, I began to lose my breath. Panting I was, and yet going downhill, not up, as if the darkness reached still further inside my mouth to strangle me. I choked in terror, gasped for air. The air, when it came, tasted heavy, metallic, and dank. I felt suffocated, as if I could not get enough of it. The underworld invaded me. At the fourth gate, my hope left me in a great trembling wave. I stumbled a moment and became aware that I walked along a narrow ledge. I pressed my body against the earthen, rocky wall. To the other side of me was nothing. Depth. I heard the demon's laughter about me, and I feared that if I fell, I would never recover the path. I tried to turn around, and I found I could not go back. As I passed the fifth gate, I became old. I felt my legs begin to shiver and creak. I thought I had been on that path 100 years. My back ached. My hand on the wall trembled. My feet stumbled. Even my heart began to feel erratic in its beat. My fears increased. How much more likely that an old woman would fall from a steep underground path than a young one. And yet, I had to go on. At the sixth gate, all of my powers deserted me. My power of reason, my power of decision, my power of action. Nothing made sense to me any longer. Why I was there, or why it was I should not let go and fall into the pit below me. I heard the demons' voices loud and louder, but I could not understand what they said, and I could not think what to reply. I no longer had any faith in myself, and that I would never escape. At the 7th gate, I dropped into the void. I lost my body. I lost consciousness. I lost everything. Inanna was no more. I think this paints a really powerful picture about what it means to actually go into the underworld, to go into your shadows, and, to experience a dark night of the soul. It kind of feels like you're losing everything, like you're kind of in chaos. You're in this void. You're in this darkness that is circling, and you can't find a way out of it, right? When you're in the underworld, it's really hard sometimes to find that light. And everything, and you feel exposed, like everything is just stripped away, and it's just all that's left is just you, right? All of the things that matter don't seem to matter anymore. All of the things that once brought you joy might not anymore. Your perspective shifts, right? How you view things shifts when you're in the underworld, when you're in the shadows, when you're in that darkness. And this is essentially Inanna. Everything has been taken from her. Everything. I mean, her crown, her symbol of being a queen, her measuring rod, her royal robes, her jewels, her golden armband, her breastplate, her protection. It's all taken away. And so we finally see, Inanna is essentially, like I said, she's naked, she's left bare, and she's, taken into the throne room and bows before her sister Ereshkigal in the throne, who's sitting on the throne. And Inanna's surrounded by the judges of the underworld, who all pass judgment on her. And it's said next in the myth, then Ereshkigal fastens on Inanna the eye of death. So she dies. She goes through this whole journey, and she's met with death herself. And she becomes a corpse. They refer to her as a piece of rotting meat, and she's then hung up on a hook on the wall. So 3 days and 3 nights pass, and Inanna's servant notices she's not returned. So her rescue plan is then put into place. So Ninshabar, her servant, dresses herself as a beggar and runs to Father Enil, pleading for his help. And he replies, "She who goes to the dark city stays there." Essentially saying, I can't help you. She's on her own. And so the servant then runs to Father Nana. And he says the same thing. And then the servant runs to Father Enki, who, as we've mentioned, the god of wisdom. And he is moved by his grief. And he's like, okay, I will help her. And it's interesting to point out that Nana, the god of the moon, who some believe to be Inanna's father, doesn't help. But Enki, the god of wisdom, who others speculate to be her father, does. So, and all of these men, everybody throughout the myths are referred to as brother, sister, father. So it's really hard to actually decipher who's who in the relationship, whether or not Ereshkigal is even her, sister, biological sister, you know what I mean? We don't know. But she refers to her as her sister, just as she refers to everybody else as sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers. So anyways, I just want to throw that in there. But so Enki, the god of wisdom, decides to help get Inanna back from the underworld. And so he takes dirt from under his fingernail, and he fashions a creature called a Kugara. And this is essentially just a sexless being. And he, uses his other hand and takes dirt from under his fingernail and fashions another one. So he has these two sexless creatures, and he basically says, go to the underworld. He gives one the food of life. He gives the other one water of life. And he says, go rescue Inanna. But you're going to be met with Ereshkigal, and you're going to have to do something to please her. And, if you do this, she'll give you a gift. She'll give you a present. So And that's when you can ask for Inanna's corpse. So they fly into the underworld kind of undisguised, and they find Ereshkigal kind of moaning, and so they imitate these moans, and she's like, who are you? Like, this draws her attention. And they go through this whole thing, and she's like, okay, like, you have pleased me, I will give you a gift. And so they ask for the corpse. So they get Inanna back, and they give her the food of life, the water of life, and Inanna arises, and she's reborn, and she's on her way out of the underworld. And it's then that she's stopped, and the judges seize her and say, you will not ascend from the underworld unmarked. And if you wish to return, somebody must stay behind in your place. There has to be this cosmic balance, right? You can't just come in and then leave like there's an absence, right? Something has to fill that absence, that void. So the Gala, or the demons, they call them, walk with Inanna to the outside gates where her servant's waiting for her, crying, and she's just, overcome with emotion, and she throws herself down immediately and says, I will go in your place. For anything, like, I will do anything for you. And Inanna's just so moved by her and her mourning and her emotion that she's like, no, I'm not going to spare my most trusted servant. So the demons and her servant accompany Inanna as she walks through the town, and they come to Shara, which is one of her sons, and he too is in mourning, and he's just overcome when he sees her. And she was like, the demons are like, okay, we'll take him. And she's like, no, I'm not sparing you, my son. So they continue on, and then they get to her other son, who is also like in mourning, just in grief, like wearing, clothes of mourning, and same thing happens. She's like, I'm not sparing my son. So they go to her palace, and she enters in, she goes into the throne room, and she sees her husband, Dumuzi, sitting on the throne, not in mourning clothes, not looking sad, but basically just like living the life, sitting up there on his throne. He is now king, right? Now that Inanna's gone, he rules. And Inanna says, you can take him. Like, he's not sad that I've left. Like, you can have him. So she fastens on him the eye of death, as they call it, and the demons carry Dumuzi off into the underworld. And some endings of the story say he escapes and changes into a snake. He calls on his brother-in-law Utu, who is the god of justice, who like takes pity on him and helps him escape, changes him into a snake. But either way, Dumuzi ends up spending half of the year in the underworld, and then the other half of the year on Earth with Inanna. And we see this play out in a different myth. So it's when he returns from the underworld, on the autumn equinox, that's when him and Inanna reunite, and they fertilize the land, and that's when harvest season, the planting, all of that begins. So because he's the shepherd, so he is the farmer, the guide for the land, the fertilizer essentially, and Inanna being the land, the goddess, the land herself. So and that's a different myth, and I kind of touched on that last week in last week's Temple Time, so if you haven't seen that, you can go over there. But one thing I wanted to point out, so that's essentially the myth of Inanna, but I just wanted to kind of go through, and talk about the underworld and our shadow sides. And Diana Wolfskin, so this book, Inanna, argues that Ereshkigal is actually the shadow side of Inanna. So they're actually one and the same. So she's kind of this neglected side of Inanna. And Ereshkigal spends her time in this dark, cold place. Says she's like eating clay and drinking dirty water. She says Wolfskin basically says it's like the suppressed sexual side of Inanna. And we see this with some other myths as well. So, but Ereshkigal is very much like Lilith in a lot of ways. This like demon goddess, right? Who is compulsive and insatiable and doesn't really have any relationships. She lives alone, and she's powerful and raging with sexuality, but these are all kind of like these deep wounds accompanied like from all of life's rejections, if that makes sense. So it's everything that Inanna has rejected or been rejected for, like this suppressed sexuality almost. So, Ereshkigal seeks solace in physical union, right? That brings her comfort. And we see this a lot. Ereshkigal, like in everything that she's depicted in, is extremely sexual and like often depicted like naked. I mean, she doesn't have anything. She lives in the underworld. Like, it's not this pretty place. And they say that you can't leave the underworld unmarked. So when we see Inanna leaving the underworld and ascending back to the heavens, where essentially like she has brought with her this side of herself, right? This shadow side, this suppressed side. And we kind of see it when she faces her husband on the throne and she's like, take him, right? Like maybe before she would have been moved, like it's her husband, it's her true love, like, they're meant to be together, her soulmate. But after the underworld, she's like, no, this is my place. I am queen. Like, you're not going to mourn me? Bye-bye. Like, she's kind of stepped into her power and she's kind of accepted the reality of everything. And I know in my own personal journeys into the underworld, dealing with the dark night of the soul, like you don't come out the other side as the same person, because like I said, there's something that it just changes the way you look at things, right? Some things just kind of fade away out of your life. Like you're able to just release them and let go of them. Like, this doesn't mean anything to me anymore. It doesn't bring me joy. Just think of like Marie Kondo, like holding something in your hand. Does this bring me joy? Like, nope. Okay, toss it. And the way that you carry yourself too. It's like you often, going through tough times in life, you often find, or you're reminded of this resilience that you have, this power that you have, your strength, and you have like this new found sense of confidence and surety. And, and I think that's what Inanna has at the end of the story. So it's a really powerful myth. I think it's a really important one to kind of, spend just one video on to talk about. And like I said, it's one of her most important. I will leave links down below to either of these books. This one is really like an archetypal journey. It says to the dark goddess, journey to the dark goddess, but this is really about descent into like your own personal underworld, letting go of things, releasing them in order to be reborn. So it's really a journey into the underworld. I think the title's slightly misleading, but that's just my own perspective. That's just my own opinion on this book. But it's extremely important. It details her descent and each gate, and there's so much symbolism in there. So it's really good for that. So I don't necessarily think of Inanna as a dark goddess being the queen of heaven. Ereshkigal is the dark goddess. The queen of the underworld is the dark goddess. She represents that part. So whether you see Inanna and Ereshkigal as one, as like the shadow side of her, that's open to interpretation. But I'm hoping that you learned something. I'm hoping that, you kind of understand not only Inanna more, but like this journey into the underworld and what it represents, and shadow work. Essentially, in modern terms, we can really decipher this as shadow work, like kind of taking everything off, right? Peeling back all of our layers and exposing the truth, exposing our naked selves, getting to the root of the problem or the issue that's causing us grief or pain or suffering, and being able to transform that and transmute it, and being able to be reborn, right? And to heal. So let me know comments below what you think. And yeah, I will see you next week for another episode of Temple Time.